All right, up next is Robert Corr. Bob is a lifelong resident of West Hartford and has a long history of community service there. Bob is an attorney in private practice who specializes in civil rights, personal injury, and landlord-tenant disputes. He's also an accomplished chef and enjoys cooking for his family and friends, and he loves traveling, and in recent years he's visited Korea, Japan, and Ireland. When I asked him about his dream winter escape, he replied with this answer. As to your question about a dream vacation, I have a slightly different reply, given how much work my wife and I have been doing to get the house ready for Passover. The Seder ends with the phrase, next year in Jerusalem. My dream exodus this time of the year is to escape to Grossinger's or Kutcher's. Oh, you guys know. One of the Jewish hotels in the Catskills, which no longer exist. And I have like a very, I know Dirty Dancing, so I feel like, Bob is carrying a watermelon. Please welcome Bob Corr. Do you know how to do the mic? You know how to do the mic? Oh, you go.
Oops. Is that good?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. Well, you'll bear with me. I'm used to talking about clients and not really about myself. But it was the 1950s. My parents and I lived in a 3-bedroom house in West Hartford. My father, Leo, owned a lumberyard and worked hard to support us. He left early in the morning and returned home between 6 and 7 p.m. on most days. My mother was always home when the school bus picked me up and brought me back. My mother, whose name was Ruth, was only 5 feet tall. Although she was short in stature, she had a strong personality and she loved me dearly. People often said they liked my mother's accent. As a child, I didn't know she had one. My family was like any other in the neighborhood, at least to a point. Leave It to Beaver had just started on TV. Although June Cleaver always wore pearls, my mother always wore a small round bandage on her arm. She was never without it. I'm 5 years old and in kindergarten. The day ended as it always did. My mother and I had dinner. My father's dinner was sitting on the hot plate, waiting for him to return home from the office. To this day, I can still remember those peas, those shriveled peas that waited for him, and the smell. My mother had read me a story before I fell asleep. At some point that night, I awakened by cries from my parents' bedroom. This wasn't the first time that I heard my mother crying out at night. Sometimes the cries came from my mother, and sometimes from my father. Fortunately, the crying stopped, and I was able to fall back asleep. In the morning, I asked my mother if she was okay. I told her that I'd heard her crying that evening. She said she had had a nightmare, but she was fine, and I shouldn't worry. She always told me not to worry. I had known that my parents had both been prisoners in concentration camps. But other than that general information, they rarely talked about their experiences in my presence. As much as I wanted to ask my mother about her nightmare, I never did. I instinctively knew that this was not a topic she wanted me to broach. As I grew older, I was able to pull some stories from her. My mother had been the oldest of 3 children. She was born in Berlin, Germany in 1920. My grandfather had been a banker. They were extremely well off. There was a chauffeur, a cook, and a housemaid that took care of the children as well. My grandfather had been a loyal and heroic German in World War I and had been awarded the Iron Cross. Like many other established Jewish families in Berlin in the 30s, they never believed how bad things would get. In 1938 or 39, my mother was sent to a boarding school in Sweden. When the war broke out and the conditions grew worse for the Jews, my mother made the decision to leave school and try to get back home to be with her family. Had she stayed put in Sweden, her life might have been very different. Somehow she made it back through Czechoslovakia. She joined the Czech underground, but was eventually captured. In 2006, my wife and I traveled to Europe. While in Prague, we decided to take a tour of Theresienstadt, where my mother had been taken after being captured. I mentioned this fact to our tour guide. Some may tell you that Theresienstadt was only a ghetto or a transit stop, and not a concentration camp. I saw the ovens where our families were cremated. It was a concentration camp. As our tour bus was leaving Theresienstadt, the guide handed me a sheet of paper. It set forth the date of July 2nd, 1942, and the number of the train that brought my mother to Theresienstadt. And then there was the date, May 15, 1944, and train number 435 that took her from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. It sent shivers through me. Last summer, I went to Poland with a group from a Holocaust museum. At some point during our 3 days spent at Auschwitz, I had hoped to be able to obtain additional information about my mom from the records department at Auschwitz. The Nazis, after all, were known for meticulous record keeping. Despite being armed with the date and train number in which my mother was brought there, I was informed that the Nazis in the final months of the war either didn't take as close records or had destroyed them. I was told that the records department might have information about the train number, but there was no manifest that they could find that showed who the passengers were getting off the cattle cars that day. My experience at Theresienstadt and Auschwitz reinforced what I had known about my mother. It took both strength and luck to survive. Perhaps that's the reason why in later life she enjoyed playing poker with friends and going to the casinos to play the one-armed bandit. She was skilled and lucky at both. Immediately after the war, my mother, who was 24 years old at the time, returned to Germany and found her brother Lutz had also survived. My uncle was involved in the black market at the time. He had some business dealings with a Jewish survivor from Riga, Latvia. At some point, my uncle mentioned that he had a sister and would his business associate like to meet her. He did, and that's how my parents met. At some point while my parents were still in Germany, my father learned that his brother Shlomo had managed to escape from a concentration camp and was now living in Palestine. My parents were not yet married, and I was not yet born. My dad said he wanted to go to Palestine, and he wanted my mother to go with him. My mom said it was her dream to go to the United States. He could come with her, or he could go to Palestine. The choice was his to make. She had just survived one war, and she had no plans to put herself in harm's way in another, what was soon to be the War of Independence for the State of Israel. In 1947, my parents were able to leave Germany on what they always described as a rickety freighter that never should have been permitted to cross the English Channel, let alone the Atlantic Ocean. The decision to come to the U.S. would not be the last time my mother would lead the way in making family decisions. In 1971, I was attending UConn as an undergraduate. My mother announced she wanted to move to Florida. My father thought she was crazy. We make our living in Connecticut, he said. Our friends are here. What will we do in Florida? My mother said she had a plan. She and my dad had both been working in real estate. My mother had already looked into the fact that there were some schools that offered weekend classes. My mother said she would fly down on Friday and return on Sunday for a number of weeks, or months, however long it would take. My dad's eyes started to bulge. And where will you live, he asked. One of the persons that she had sold some property to was now a widow, and she had offered her an extra bedroom whenever she needed it. My mother had been in touch with her, and that was the plan. My dad was now sure that my mother was nuts. My mother didn't often make such monumental family decisions on her own, but my dad knew that this was different. Just as she had been determined to come to the U.S., this was an idea she was not willing to let up on. So they made an agreement. If my mother would get her Florida real estate license, they'd move. Well, it took longer than my mother had projected, but she eventually got her license. So while I was attending UConn, my parents moved to Florida. They packed their clothes and a few possessions. The possessions my mother took included a box of small round bandages that she always wore on her arm. I always thought their move to Florida was unusual. In most families, it's the children who leave home and the parents stay put. In my case, I stayed in Connecticut and my parents left home. Go figure. My father died in 1980. My mother was just 59. My mother continued to live and work there and never remarried. In November 2006, my mother called and told me she had not been feeling well for several weeks, and she was now jaundiced. She had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Her doctor in Florida, who I always thought was a quack, had now wanted to put her into a hospital there. I told my mother, that's not possible. You can't be treated in the small town of Northport where you live. Instead, I arranged for her to fly to Connecticut for treatment here. My mother arrived 2 days later, and my doctor agreed to see her the following day. My mother was then admitted to Hartford Hospital for surgery. I was told the surgery would take several hours, but instead it took twice as long. My mother, who was always short, now appeared even shorter and frail. Though I knew that pancreatic cancer was generally a death sentence, I'd expected my mother would at least have several more months of life. Instead, the surgeon told me that my mother would probably not survive the night and I should begin making funeral arrangements. What the doctor didn't understand was that this was not his typical patient. This was an Auschwitz survivor, a survivor of conditions that remain incomprehensible to most of us. My mother was not yet ready to die. She remained in the hospital for 10 or 11 days, and she was eventually discharged. For a while, my mother's condition seemed to improve. I allowed myself to think that the doctors had misdiagnosed her. But by July, her condition began to decline. In August, she had to be admitted to the Hebrew home. She remained there for a few weeks, occasionally having a good hour or two, occasionally being able to talk and aware of my presence. As August came, however, she began to have more pain and slept more often and rarely was able to speak, rarely was able to know that I was there. I remember at one point leaning over her bed, giving her a kiss on her forehead, and telling her it was okay to stop fighting. I would never forget her. 2 days later, on August 22, 2007, she died in her sleep. When I arrived in her room, she was laying there, pain-free and appearing to be at peace. Her left arm, on which she had always kept a small round bandage, was no longer covered, and for all to see was her number from Auschwitz. She had lived her life always looking forward and never back. Her number hadn't defined her in life, and it didn't at death. Thank you.
Beautiful story, Bob. Thank you. Beautiful. My parents did the same thing to me, Bob. They left me here in Connecticut. They moved to Massachusetts. They don't pop in.